The Single Tracks podcast is brought to you by TPC, the Pros Closet. Spring is the perfect time to upgrade, and TPC has an industry-leading selection of new and certified pre-owned bikes, plus frames, wheels, and accessories. Each certified pre-owned bike is inspected, tested, and serviced, and every bike includes 30-day returns. Visit tpc.bike/singletracks and enter code singletracks40 to save $40 on every order over $200. That's the Pros Closet at tpc.bike/singletracks, and look for the link and coupon code in the show notes. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today Matt Miller and I are going to be talking about downcountry mountain bikes. What do you think about this topic, Matt? You excited to talk about downcountry bikes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. It's been a fun category to watch over the past few years, and just watch it develop and everything from being somewhat of a new term to being ubiquitous with like this travel category now. So
yeah. Well, so I think a lot of our listeners, I mean, they've probably heard the term before, but what does downcountry mean? What does it mean to you? I don't know that we like have a actual like dictionary definition of what it is, but like, yeah, where does it come from? What do we think it means?
I think if I was going to sum it up succinctly, I would just say it's a fun cross-country bike, but it's even a little bit more than a cross-country bike, right? Like it's a travel spec that used to be cross-country that now has more aggressive geometry and better suspension. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say just a fun, aggressive, short travel trail bike or long travel cross-country bike. See, it's like I'm already confused on like how to describe it. So
yeah, right. Well, it does clearly, the term is related to cross-country, right? So we substituted cross for down. Right. So, I mean, if I think about it that way, you think about cross country, I don't know, I tend to think about like a race course and it's kind of rolling. It's like up and down, but it's mostly really pedally, like you're pedaling a lot.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if we say we're not going like across country, we're going down country, maybe that means like it's more descent focused or maybe it's like cross country, but with like bigger hills.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say it's just a mix or amalgamation of, downhill and cross country, like the pedaling attributes of a cross country bike and the descending attributes of a downhill bike, even though that's a really big gap from the two. But yeah, you'd give a bike, attributes of both.
Right. It's a huge gap. And I've explained it that way to folks too, like friends who ride and like aren't super, caught up on the industry lingo. And, I throw out a term like downcountry and they're like, what is that?
Yeah.
And, that was my explanation. And people, their eyes just kind of like pop out of their heads. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense that you would combine like the two extremes on the spectrum into this new category. And to be clear too, it's like, we're not talking about travel that's right in the middle either, right? Like, if you took a 100 mil cross country bike and a 200 mil downhill bike, we're not talking about like 150 in the middle, because that would be like all mountain enduro. So this is like short travel trail bike.
Yes. Yeah. And, I mean, because we just wrote up an analytics piece on the geometry. And I think if you look at where the trend has settled, and these are the numbers that, I use to kind of look at these bikes, it's travel between 115 and 125 millimeters, to where even, if you had 130 millimeters, it's like, I don't know, I see it as a trail bike.
Yeah.
And then to make it a little bit more narrow, if you look at almost all the bikes out there, they have 120 millimeters of rear travel. In 130 millimeter fork. So that 120 mil travel spec is, I'd say 100 to 120 has always been reserved for these cross country bikes, with, a cross country bike having a little bit more travel at the 120 end. And now it's like, if you look at almost any bike from any brand out there with 120 millimeters of travel, it'll probably have a 130 millimeter fork and the aggressive geometry to go with it.
Yeah. That's interesting how it's all kind of settled into this spec. Before we move on, talking about the term downcountry, like what do you have a personal opinion about it? Like, I feel like a lot of people, they don't like the term or they think it's silly. Like, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I thought it was stupid when I first started hearing it. And yeah, if we look back at our archives, like it showed up in the first time for single tracks in like 2018, which is a while ago. And I think that was still so early that nobody, like it hadn't really caught on by then. And then everybody starts saying it and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so dumb. And then now it's like, whatever. It's a bike and it's really easy to identify like what type of bike it is just by using that term.
Yeah.
Sort of like, back in the day, we used to bicker about using the term enduro bike for, 160 mil travel bike. And it might sound dumb at first, but then it's just really easy to identify a bike in that category.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not like people sit around and like debate various terms we could use. It's just like people throw around terms and one of them catches on and that's kind of it. Like we, as the media,
Totally.
We don't get to decide. We didn't make it up. Like, yeah, you got to call it something. So it's kind of like, who cares if we like it or we don't? Like, that's the term.
Yeah.
And I think of like flow trail too. When I first heard that term, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what is this? But yeah, after a few years, you see enough of it in print and online and, you start using the term yourself. It makes a lot of sense. I feel like that's where we're at with downcountry. People have stopped kind of resisting it and we're like, okay, this is shorthand for short travel trail bike.
Yes. Yeah, totally. It's everywhere. Everybody says it.
Yep.
Whatever.
Get over it. Right. So yeah, you talked about a little bit the cutoff in terms of travel, like what we're considering to be a downcountry bike is one with 115 to 125 millimeters of rear travel. But really most manufacturers have chosen 120, I guess, because it's an even number. And then they're pairing that with like 130 millimeter travel fork. So what else makes a bike downcountry? Like we've been saying for a while, just in general about mountain biking, that weight is not that important anymore. We've kind of gotten past that, or a lot of riders have. What do you think about for downcountry? Does that distinguish the bikes from other bikes, like in different categories?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the two go together, but the build spec and then the weight is going to be a lot different than, what you'd have on a basic cross country bike. In that weight is less important to you because you want the capability and durability that are going to go along with like heavier parts. So yeah, like a 35 mil, like a RockShox Pike or a Fox 34 instead of, a Fox 32, because you want the added stiffness up front. Heavier tires because, you don't want to puncture because you're going to be riding it more aggressively, or, you're going to be riding this 120 mil bike on something that's looser and rockier than you would ride on a cross country bike. So all these things that kind of have these trade-offs, and, again, like in my opinion, the frame is at 120 millimeters, it's still going to pedal so well that at least I know I'm willing to take that sacrifice of like added weight and slower rolling resistance for the added confidence that goes along with those components. Yeah.
And right. I mean, it makes sense that if you look at the spectrum of mountain bikes, obviously the average cross country bike is going to weigh a lot less than the average downhill bike. And there's kind of a spectrum in between. Like as you go from cross country to downhill, the bikes get a little heavier on average. And so it makes sense that a downcountry bike, I mean, it's going to be much lighter than, say, an enduro bike, but maybe it's going to weigh a little more than a cross country bike. And then just in terms of the spec, like you were mentioning, I mean, it does seem like the bikes are being spec'd to be more comfortable than a cross country bike and to be a little bit like more fun oriented. For me, I still think of cross country whenever I hear that. I immediately think race, that's not like a bike that you would ride out on the weekends for fun or, after work. Like cross country is pretty race oriented, whereas downcountry kind of substitute some of those like racy components with stuff that's going to be a little more comfortable, a little more capable for like more technical or faster trails.
Yeah, totally. And then I think the way that it's evolved too is like, have like a perfect race bike for these kind of like vacation races that so many people love to do, like BC Bike Race or Moab Rocks or Pisgah Stage Race or something like that, to where, if you're doing it on a dedicated cross country bike before, it's like, I don't know if it's going to be the most fun thing, but now you've got a decent bike with good components and this aggressive geometry. It's like I'd ride my Ibis Ripley AF on BC Bike Race all day long compared to a 100mm Specialized Epic or something like that.
Yeah.
Because it would hold up fine. And it would just be the perfect bike for any race like that. And so, I also think it's like, it's brought riders into that travel category that had never been interested in it before either. Like myself and a lot of my friends got into mountain biking because we were attracted to long travel bikes and this idea of like free riding or enduro riding and going fast downhill. And would never have bought a bike below like 150 millimeters. And then all of a sudden this category got cool and the marketing around it got cool.
Yeah.
And so now it's like you see more and more riders picking up one of these bikes and actually getting interested in like putting in longer days in the saddle, riding longer, and, all the things that kind of come along with that travel spec.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, thinking about the types of races, I think you're dead on. Like these stage races, these, more experience-based races where people are doing it for fun. They're not necessarily there to compete. And then, I also think of like bike packing potentially. If it was kind of a rougher route, more single track focused, I could definitely see Downcountry making sense there. I mean, assuming you could fit like frame bags if it's that type of race. I mean, the fact that it has suspension does limit that use, rear suspension. And I also think like marathon cross country races as well. Like you could see that depending on the course, and even regular cross country. I think you're seeing that riders, professional riders, like having kind of a choice between a very cross country focused bike versus another bike that's kind of downcountry territory for more technical cross country courses.
Yeah, definitely. Right. There's kind of a greater delineation between what a 100mm bike is and a 120mm bike is. And for example, the bike that we'll talk about a little bit later, the BC40, I think does just that, to where you can spec it shorter or longer depending on the type of racing you're going to be doing, whether it's a marathon or whether it's more aggressive.
Yeah. So we talked about these downcountry bikes in terms of their rear suspension travel. That got me wondering, can a hardtail be a downcountry bike? Like, I don't know that we've seen a hardtail marketed as such, but like, does that even make sense?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think all the marketing around it and the categorization is all leaned into the full suspension market and those travel categories. But then I guess, it begs the question because, why wouldn't it be? If you think of the history of hardtails as like a cross-country bike and how they've gotten more aggressive over time and how they have bigger forks than they used to. But people call certain hardtails enduro hardtails, right? So I guess why couldn't it?
Downhill hardtails, yes. Yeah, right. It is interesting because, I mean, really, if we're, again, talking about, you mentioned 130mm front suspension travel on a downcountry bike, if you put that on a hardtail, right now, most people would call that a hardcore hardtail. And that's the Kona folks. They don't care for that term, but like really, that's kind of what we call it. But maybe downcountry is a better label for that. I don't know. Yeah,
that's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, the way my brain works and categorization and wanting to put things in boxes and stuff like that, it's just like, nope, that's a full suspension label.
Right. Yeah. Right. And at the end of the day, like you said, it's just a label. Maybe it doesn't matter. So another weird thought I had or question is like, what about electric downcountry bikes? Like, is that a thing? I mean, we are seeing a lot of like shorter travel, lighter weight e-bikes. That's kind of a category. And I don't know that we have really a good label for that either right now. I mean, and there's clearly a difference, I mean, there's like electric mountain bikes that have like huge batteries and lots of travel, and, they're basically like self-shuttling bikes. Whereas then there's another group of electric bikes that are lighter weight. They're more like, traditional mountain bikes, and they're shorter travel as well. So are there any bikes that come to mind that maybe could fit that moniker, like an electric downcountry bike?
I don't know. I'm having a tough time thinking of any off the top of my head. Like the two that come to mind as being shorter travel trail bikes or e-bikes that both came out last year, the Trek Fuel EXE and the Pivot Shuttle SL. And both of those are still, the Shuttle SL was 132, 135 millimeters of rear travel. Mm-hmm. And I don't know off the top of my head what the Fuel EXE was, but those have kind of been like the lightest e-bike options out there so far. Although I wouldn't be surprised to see brands developing like shorter travel e-bikes. And I think the complication so far has been trying to fit in, like one, finding the right type of motor, because both of those bikes used, a smaller, slimmer, like Trek used, I think, their own motor, and Pivot used a Fazua, which is a really small motor. And one, they had to wait till either they developed the right motor, smaller motor to make the bike, or until the motor was available. And I don't see why you couldn't use that same one on a shorter travel bike. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that also might be a sign of the consumers are ready to adopt an e-bike with that short of travel, because so long, or at least thus far, e-bikes have been reserved for really long travel bikes, and now they've gotten smaller and lighter, like the Orbea Rise and these other two that I was just mentioning. And so, I mean, the way that mountain bike traditionalists have thought about it is like, okay, it's stupid to put a motor on a bike that's already light and, has such a small travel amount that it's so easy to pedal already. But I think those two bikes, like the Trek, the Orbea and the Pivot, have done really well with, finding a market for a smaller e-bike. For example, when you and I went to Arkansas last year, like those trails would have been perfect for a shorter e-bike. And I think, we actually rode the Orbea Rise there. And so, I mean, I think there's definitely a market for a shorter travel e-bike. I just don't know if the brands are there yet.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure it's going to happen. Somebody's going to try it. Whether or not people buy it, I guess that remains to be seen. And to me, it always seems weird to like, because with Downcountry, you're starting to get into that like XC, you race, you're very close to that. And it seems weird to me that you would try to put a motor into like a XC bike, because after all, isn't XC all about just like fitness and like how fast you can ride kind of on your own power? And I think of like many years ago, I rode, I think it was an Orbea electric road bike. And to me, it was like, I don't understand the concept, because I mean, and this was not like a casual, like, oh, you can go commute on it. I mean, this was like a performance based road bike with like, battery integrated into the tube and, look like a traditional road bike. But it's like hard to understand exactly who that's for. And I don't even know if they still make that, or if that's a category that Orbea or others are pursuing. But it does seem like it's a very limited set of buyers for that kind of concept.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't think the electric road bike market has slowed down at all, but a very different market from, the people you might see pedaling around recreation district or bike path on an e-bike than the people you'd see on a big windy mountain, summit on a road performance e-bike.
Yeah.
But the bike industry is good at, creating markets for itself. So
we will definitely see one. Whether or not people buy it, who knows? So we talked about how downcountry bikes are different from cross-country bikes. Are they different from trail bikes? Like when somebody says trail bike, what do you think of? Is it something with like a little bit more travel, or do you think downcountry is like a part of that?
Well, I think to like play off the last sentence I just made about the bike industry creating markets for itself, I think it's done a great job at further delineating the trail bike category into downcountry, because now it's like, I mean, what really is the distinction between a trail bike and a downcountry bike? At that point, it's just travel.
Right.
And then you're picking a travel, you're picking a bike with travel that's suitable for the trails that you're going to ride.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, again, it's just the geometry has come so far to make the downcountry category possible and let buyers choose a bike based on what travel suits them rather than what geometry suits them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't think there's a big distinction between the two categories anymore. I think most riders are just going to choose a bike now based on what travel is appropriate for their own trails.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I always wish that I had access to like sales numbers for the industry as a whole to see like what types of bikes people are buying. But, I feel like it's a pretty good guess that most mountain bikes being sold are trail bikes. It's got to be the biggest category. Obviously XC and downhill, those are like two extreme ends. Probably a lot of enduro bikes being sold, but still we would guess that for most sort of recreational riders, core riders, trail bikes are what they're going to be looking at. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense if that's your biggest category that maybe you need to like break it into subcategories. And for me too, we can throw out another term there within the trail category that, which is all mountain.
Yeah.
And I use that myself to sort of distinguish sort of the longer travel end of trail bikes versus the shorter travel. And so for me, maybe what I'm left with is downcountry and all mountain as being like kind of splitting the trail category in half, just because the bikes are pretty different when you start talking about, again, like you said, their intended use and how much travel you need for the trails that you're going to ride.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that's fair. Especially with the all mountain category. That used to be kind of like a more popular moniker for like those travel numbers too. And it's pretty silent. Like I wouldn't call the, 140 to, or I guess 135 to like 150 category, like boring. I just think that it hasn't gotten as much attention as downcountry in the past several years.
Yeah.
And as much focus, because there's a ton of good bikes, between 135 and 150 that I think are out. Like the Trek Fuel EX I rode last year was probably my favorite bike of the year.
Yeah.
But yeah, that category is just a whole, I don't think is like quite as hot as downcountry is still.
Yeah. Yeah, you make a good point. And like the longer I'm in the industry, the more I see this pattern of like, it's not that these categories like all mountain disappear or that like brands stop making the bikes or anything, but they definitely don't talk about them as much as they do whatever the hot category is. And so right now, like the industry as a whole, it's gravel bikes. So, we're heading to Sea Otter in a few weeks, and I guarantee you, the bike brands, most of the bike brands will be there. And I'm pretty sure what we'll see is at the front of these tents is going to be like all gravel bikes. And that's not to say that like, they stop making mountain bikes or whatever. It's just like, this is kind of the focus area right now. And so that's where you're going to see kind of like new bikes coming out and you're going to see developments. And yeah, it's kind of on this cycle. We saw it with fat bikes. We've seen it with electric mountain bikes. We'll probably see a lot of that too. That one, along with gravel, is certainly still a focus area. But yeah, all mountain bikes. I mean, for me too, like that's a great choice as well. No better or no worse than say downcountry.
Yeah, 100%. So much gravel right now. It's it's cool, but it's also a little annoying.
Right. Yeah, we'll get past it, and who knows what the next thing is, but there will be a next thing. So, yeah, you mentioned you did an analysis of sort of the current bikes on the market that are within this downcountry category, a category that we had to make a cutoff in terms of like travel numbers to say like, is this downcountry or is this cross country? And so, yeah, what did you find like in terms of the geometry for downcountry bikes? Like, can you look at the geometry and say that's downcountry without considering the travel? Like, is it very distinct from, say, other categories?
Well, yeah, it's hard to say because I think a lot of trail bikes are still not far off of these numbers that downcountry bikes have settled on as far as a lot of the geometry. Like, I think if you looked at the average geometry, which we found was like, yeah, it was a little bit under 66 for the head tube angle, like somewhere around 65 and a half to 66, so 65.75, and then a 76 degree C tube angle. Reach on like mediums I found was about 450. So yeah, still like pretty roomy. And then, yeah, I mean, trail bikes as a whole have gotten more aggressive than that lately, but like I wouldn't turn down a trail bike because it was still, I don't know, it's weird to call those numbers conservative, but I would still ride a trail bike with those numbers because it's just good geometry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, it's a hard question.
Yeah. Right. We'd have to like do this analysis of all the categories kind of simultaneously because they are always changing and evolving. And to me, like just that head tube angle, like really pops off the page because it's like 65 degrees, 65 and change. A few years ago, that would have been like enduro or, I was definitely not riding bikes that were anywhere near that. 68 was like, oh, that's kind of slack.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is constantly evolving. And again, like it is a spectrum. So I imagine if we were to kind of run that analysis, you'd see head tube angles kind of, going down by a degree or so between the categories. And similarly, I don't know about C tube angles like that. It seems like everybody kind of agrees no matter what kind of bike you're looking at, you want a steeper C tube angle, at least for the bikes that you're going to be climbing on, which is like everything up through enduro, everything except downhill. And then, yeah, things like reach, like you said, that's kind of like it's like a comfort number more than it is necessarily like performance based, just kind of getting into that position where you feel comfortable on the bike. And then, yeah, like looking at chain stays, 435. I mean, I feel like that number is burned into my brain because that's like pretty much what every bike is. And, everybody says, oh, it's playful and it's flickable and it's, whatever. But yeah. So those numbers, I think you're right. They don't necessarily stand out kind of on their own.
Right. Yeah. I have been like tossing this around in my head for a while as far as like, man, not every short travel bike needs to be raked out and there's still a place for conservative geometry and just hoping that like not every brand completely rakes out their trail bikes and makes them like long and turns them into, mini enduro bikes. And I think like so far it's been okay, even on these slacker short travel bikes with a good like short offset fork. And I think it's really dependent on the wheelbase length too, because a 65 degree head tube angle on, a size medium with 1190 millimeter wheelbase is going to feel still a lot more agile than, a bike with an inch more wheelbase. I've been surprised that, yeah, even as bikes have gotten slacker and slacker, it still doesn't take away from the sharpness of a bike if you have the other numbers right.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we talked about sort of the origin of this downcountry term, and I guess you said first time Single Tracks mentioned it was like 2018, so 4 or 5 years ago. What were some of the earliest downcountry bikes that you remember seeing?
Yeah, and it's funny, I looked that up in our archives when I was writing the Downcountry geometry piece, and funny enough, that was in reference to an Ibis hardtail at the time.
Oh, so there are downcountry hardtails.
Yeah.
There were.
And I don't know, I'd have to ask Jero because when he was with us at the time, he's the one who wrote or flipped around that press release. But I would assume that label came in the press release from Ibis at that time.
Okay.
And so, yeah, for whatever reason, I think the word started getting a buzz, 2018, maybe later in the year. I think the following year, I remember getting an early ride on the Santa Cruz Tallboy when they completely redid it. And I really think that bike set the category on fire. So it's 2019. And I remember meeting with Seb from Santa Cruz and him giving me a preview before I rode it around Whistler for a couple of days. And that had a 65 and a half or 65. I can't remember off the top of my head, but a head tube angle. And, him being like, because I had just done BC Bike Race and him mentioning, oh yeah, this would have probably been a great bike for that race. And I was thinking, yeah, of course it would. And then the marketing to go along with it. I mean, yeah, Santa Cruz always has good marketing, but who was it that did the video for that bike? Luca Shaw, as far as it being like the Downhillers XC bike. And then all of a sudden it was a really cool thing to dive into these bikes. I really think that bike deserves a lot of the credit for popularizing the category. But, from there's, the Giant Trance, the Ibis Ripley AF. I don't think that came out until 2021. But yeah, that bike too, I think, again, like giving it the more aggressive nature and like setting it apart and saying, hey, our aluminum bike is going to be, some might argue, better than our carbon version of the Ripley because of the geometry and the suspension characteristics. But yeah, I think those were, a handful of like the earlier bikes that really gave rise to the category. And then a lot of brands have still been catching up. I'd mentioned like the Transition Spur because they've been they've always been kind of cool kids, aggressive geometry type brand too. And so to see them doing like, I believe their shortest trail bike ever with the Spur. Yeah, I also think that helped the category out quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Right. It's interesting that's great. I didn't kind of connect all of that history together, but I think that's spot on. Like that's kind of the genesis of the category. And you mentioned too, how like press releases and marketing can kind of play into that stuff in terms of like what the label is and how it gets applied. And, for me too, we talked about like travel numbers, using that as kind of our guide for like, is this Downcountry or not? But at the end of the day, like the brands kind of decide that, right? Like if they're calling their bike a Downcountry bike, then, that's kind of signaling the intentions, whether or not like the travel lines up or not, or the geo is different from somebody else's. Like they're all kind of interpreting this idea of bikes that traditionally, climb really well. They're very pedalable, but now we're making them more capable for descents, which is kind of the opposite of enduro, right? Where you're taking a bike that's like really great at descents and like, let's make it so it can and pedal better. And so, yeah, it's kind of natural. It's kind of like, wait, why didn't we think of this before? And you mentioned too, like the Ibis Ripley AF, the Ripley had been around before and it was more kind of cross country. And so, you saw this like more aggressive version with, I believe it had a little bit more travel. And you see that from kind of all the brands over the last few years where they're making like an Evo version of their cross country bike, or they're doing these things that move it more toward that idea of like a fun descending bike that also pedals really, really well.
Yeah. I had somebody tell me one time, hey, do you know how you can identify a good product launch? And that's it. If you look at all the different publications talking about the product launch, they're all saying the same thing. And that's, for people that don't know, when a bike launches, publications receive press materials from a brand, and, it's our job to kind of like decipher what's going on and turn it into, somewhat of an original piece. It doesn't happen a lot in bike media, but you could tell a good product launch if the brand has a strong, consistent message and all publications are picking up on that message. And so, I would say that media gets a lot of credit or blame. You could say it either way for driving a narrative. But at a lot of times, it happens at the PR level and communications and marketing level. To where the brands want you to, and want the media to sort of relay this message that they're driving. And it works. Yeah, it works a lot of times.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so you mentioned the Santa Cruz Tallboy. I forget what version that was, like Gen 3, 4, something like that. So this was like 4 or 5 years ago. One of the earliest bikes that we would now call Downcountry. And that was a bike that you tested. So let's talk about some of those Downcountry bikes that we've ridden, I guess, starting with the Tallboy.
Yeah, it's funny because, I rode that and I've had friends who rode it too. And I think everyone was attracted to like this short travel package with aggressive geometry. And, I remember getting on trails on that bike in Whistler and being like, okay, like the geometry feels capable, it feels stable enough, but the travel is still a limiting factor. Like you're not 120 millimeters of travel is still 120 millimeters of travel at the end of the day. So it definitely has its limits despite.
Right. You didn't take it on A-line?
No. Yeah. Kept it out of the bike park for that one.
Yeah.
But A-line probably would have been fine just because it's a jump trail. And like,
right.
I think that would be even better on a jump trail than some long travel bikes. But yeah, I mean, it's, if you're on the right type of trail, you're going to outrun your travel in a bike like that. And I mean, the same is true for any of those bikes. Is like, yes, it's got good geometry, you can feel comfortable, but at the end of the day, it's still a pretty small amount of travel. I forget where we started with the question, but those are kind of the early impressions. Super fun bike, but it does still have its limitations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So another bike that you and I both tested was the Allied BC40, and we did kind of like a little creative review of that, like sort of chat based. I mean, we literally chatted and then we shared the transcript from our online chat. But yeah, we got to ride that in Arkansas, where Allied is based, and rode it on the back 40 trails, which the bike is named for. So yeah, what did you take away from that in terms of like that bike and what Downcountry means and what it can kind of do? Yeah,
I mean, I think if you look at that bike and then you look at the Santa Cruz Tallboy, and the main difference in the travel categories is that the Tallboy has a 130 millimeter fork, whereas the Allied BC40 has 120, and both still kind of fit inside this category, but they're two very different bikes. I really like the Allied BC40, but that one felt like more of a cross-country bike, a capable cross-country bike. But at the end of the day, it was still a cross-country bike with evolved geometry. And you can look at the suspension platform and make that distinction too, with it being like a single pivot with compliant chain stays or seat stays, purely just to save weight. And you could look at the tire choice. You could look at some of the other component choices too. And really say that the Allied and bikes like that are much more cross-country oriented than something like the Ibis Ripley AF or the Tallboy. Yeah, I think an interesting one is the one that you last tested was the Evil Following, because if you think of Evil, it's also this aggressive brand with, its roots like in descending. But then the geometry on that bike is still fairly conservative for what people might assume out of a short travel Evil. Yeah. Like, did you feel like it was more of a trail bike or? I do. Right. So, I mean, I was going to make the same points that you are, because, I've got a list here of the bikes that I've tested that kind of fall into that Downcountry category. And looking through it, it's like they all ride very differently. And some are going to be much more closer to the cross country end of the spectrum. Like you mentioned, the Allied that we tested, still it's not a cross country bike. Like I would race it in, say, 100-mile single track race, or, if I was just doing 100 miles for fun, which I wouldn't do, but if I were into that sort of thing, I would ride the BC40, because it has just enough travel, but it's still super efficient. Again, like a cross country bike. But the Evil, the Following, definitely my favorite of the Downcountry bikes that I've tested. And you mentioned too, like sort of the brands, like Transition is another one as well. That's like, I don't know. They're definitely more known for their like gravity or like longer travel bikes. And so I was a little skeptical about the bike, like worried that it would go too far in either direction. Right. So like either, they try to make a cross country bike and, it's just weird and not right, or that they took all this like really aggressive geometry and stuff that they are doing in their longer travel bikes and trying to do it in like a short travel package. But I found that the Following, it really does blend those two. And for me, when I think of Downcountry, that's kind of the one I have in my mind currently. Like it makes a lot of sense that it's lighter weight than a lot of these like, longer travel bikes. Obviously it climbs really well, but it also descends really, really well. And so, it's kind of the best of both worlds. Yeah. And again, I think I like where evil is that with that bike, because they didn't just turn it into like this total sled.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like they realized that putting sharper numbers on a bike like that is going to keep its intentions true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's hard to know exactly like kind of how these bikes are designed. I mean, we talked to a lot of designers and things and like how it goes from concept to like the bike that you're riding.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it seemed like what they're doing and what, some of the best downcountry bikes do is that they start with a cross-country bike that climbs really well. That's like a really efficient climber. Like that's what it excels at. And then they kind of start building in the things that are going to make it descend better and just be more fun to ride. And I just really got that impression with that bike that, they almost like if you think of a bike's capabilities in terms of like how well does it climb and how well does it descend, it's almost like they're getting closer to 50-50 on a short travel bike, which is kind of surprising. And like, how could that be possible? But yeah, I think for me, that one's a pretty prototypical downcountry bike. There are other ones that you've ridden that kind of stand out or that are maybe a little bit different from the Allied or from the Tallboy?
I remember really liking the Pivot Trail 429, the latest generation of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's got all the characteristics of a pivot that you would, highly regard. It's light, very stiff. It climbed very well. And then at the same time, like once you get used to the ride feel of it and how light and stiff and agile it is, it's a super capable bike too. And yeah, like you said, like I think that descending and climbing capability are a good match together.
Yeah.
And then I think about like the Norco Optic that we reviewed as like our mid-travel mashup a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And where that, if we look at this category, it barely fit in because it was 125 mil of rear travel and then 140 millimeter fork. So it was quite a bit over forked.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like that one, I feel like I would just call it a trail bike at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And so one of the ones that I have in for testing right now that is a little different, a little outside of that travel category as well. On the other end is the Canyon Lux Trail. And again, this is one of those where, Canyon had the Lux, which was a cross-country bike. And so they evoed it or they, AF'd it or whatever.
Right.
They're calling it trail. They trailed it. And to me, that bike, it still feels very much like a cross-country bike. And looking at the travel too, it is less than, I believe, where our cutoff is. I think it's maybe 110 rear, 120 front, something like that. And so that one, initially too, it felt very different because I came off the Evil bike and then started riding that one, and it felt very cross-country to me. And it's funny because these are kind of the same category. I mean, they're not too far off in terms of their travel, or I'd have to look at the geometry, but I imagine it's pretty similar as well. But to get such a different ride feel is surprising. And so it's not as if like downcountry is this magical category that's just like, oh, you got to get a downcountry bike. Like they're amazing. They're all very different in terms of like the ride feel, and it's going to come down to like how you like to ride, the trails you like to ride, and all that. Because I'm sure there are people who like, oh man, Canyon Lux Trail, like that's the perfect bike for me. And for me, it's like a little more cross country than I would like, just for like going out and having fun. It's probably a more capable race bike, for example, than the following. But again, like depends what you're into.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It might be a perfect bike for somebody who, maybe is getting older and not quite as confident in their descending capability as they used to be and want cross-country bike still, but something with a little bit more edge than what the typical Lux is going to offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Another one that I tested fairly recently was the Alchemy Arctos 120. And that's kind of an interesting bike too, because they are essentially using kind of the same frame and they're changing up the amount of travel. So there's like an Arctos 120, there was a 135, and I think there was like a 150 or 150.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this one was kind of the downcountry version of that bike. And that one was different in that, like, it seemed to have a lot of the aggressive geometry of like a more mid travel or even enduro bike, but just was slimmed down travel. And for me, like, that combo didn't really work that well, like, because it wasn't like a dedicated, like, we're gonna, do this kind of from the ground up and make this. Same with the Lux. Like, again, it's like we have this bike and we're gonna swap a few components, but essentially it's still kind of this other bike with a different intention. And so I guess I say all that to let people know, like, if you have a cross country bike and you're thinking, oh, I want to make it more down country, by all means, like, you might be able to do that, but it's not necessarily as simple as like just putting a longer fork on it or getting wider tires or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I remember thinking the same thing, looking at the geometry charts between the Alchemy Arctos 120 and their 130 or 135 or whatever it was then. And yeah, 'cause I believe it is just, swapping out a different shock link to accommodate the travel changes. And to me, reviewing the geometry on there, it just, it was very off base of like what I would want out of a bike with that small travel or short of travel.
Yeah.
And that the reach was just way longer than, I would consider. And there, like you said, there've been a couple brands that have done that when Yeti's since overhauled their lineup since then. But when they had the Yeti SP100, I think they took the same frame and made a similar change and came out with a 115 that had more conservative geometry. I'm not 100% positive on this, but I know it was not. The geometry wasn't improved over the 100.
Yeah.
And so I think that I would assume that turned some buyers off from the 115 over the 100 is that, you take the frame you have now, you swap out the shock link and make it a longer travel bike. And then it really just does nothing for the geometry to, grow along with the travel change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so another bike that was like that was the Ibis Ripley when they went to the AF, I'm guessing, right? And you own that bike, right? So like, what were they able to make that transition like better than some of the others, or is it like a completely different frame from the original Ripley?
Yeah, it is a completely different frame. And I believe even the kinematics are different from the original Ripley. And because they last updated the Carbon Ripley in 2019. I think that was when you wrote it. And I mean, it's been 4 years, so maybe we'll see another new Carbon Ripley soon. But then the AF came out 2 years after the Carbon Ripley. And same with the Ripmo AF. Like, they're both different geometry. I believe the Ripmo AF and Ripmo Carbon are different geometry, but I know the Ripley AF is different from the Carbon Ripley geometry. But completely different geometry and different kinematics than the Carbon version, which would make sense because if you've got carbon molding cut for the the Carbon Ripley, then you can just use different tubing and sort of design it as a different frame. Yeah. And so I'm guessing it works pretty well. I mean, you're obviously a fan of the Ripley AF in terms of it like being a downcountry bike. Do you call it a downcountry bike, or is that just like your trail bike? No, I guess if anything, I call it a short travel bike. Yeah, I mean, it's just a product of working in the industry, so I've got that, and then a longer travel bike. So yeah, I mean, I usually just tell people I have a shorter travel bike and a longer travel bike, and I use them on different trails. Yeah. Well,
so that brings me to my question of whether you think a downcountry bike could be a quiver killer. Like, again, we're talking about this like this is some magical category that's just like the best of the best of both worlds. But is it, I mean, obviously for you, it's not. Like, you have a short travel, like downcountry-ish bike, and then you also have a longer travel one. Do you think most riders are going to be that way as well when they consider downcountry bikes?
No, I mean, I think it depends on the rider and what they're riding. I will say, before I had the Ripley AF, I had a 130 millimeter trail bike, and there still feels like a huge difference between just the 130 millimeter Revel trail bike I had before and the 120 millimeter Ibis in terms of capability and how it rides. So yeah, I mean, like most people are going to pick one bike based on one bike that can handle the majority of what they ride. And, you know, they might find that they don't need more than 120 millimeters to accomplish the mission, like most of the time. I would say that, yeah, personally, like I would have stayed with a larger travel bike if I didn't have a larger travel bike. So if I didn't have, you know, longer travel Canfield, which is what I have now, then I would have picked a bike with more travel instead of the Ibis Ripley AF, because it's not the bike I would do everything on.
Right. Yeah. So kind of split the difference. Like if you were limited, you can only get one bike, you get something in between a long and a short travel, which, yeah, I think makes a lot of sense. And it's always funny when you talk about the idea of quiver killer. And again, that's another one of those terms. Maybe some people are like, stop saying that. I hate that word or that term or whatever. But the idea being that there's one bike that will meet all of your riding needs. And obviously all of us are different. And so, you know, if you're only interested in riding your local trails, and maybe when you travel, you want to ride trails that are similar to your local trails, then yeah, like you could probably find a bike that's going to suit that and is going to be sort of your do-all bike. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, if you're somebody, I mean, I enjoy all kinds of riding. I enjoy gravel riding. I like bike packing. I like riding trail. Every now and then I like riding bigger stuff. Then yeah, I mean, no, there's not a bike that's going to fit all of that. A downcountry bike certainly won't do all that. There's specialized tools for the different types of rides that you're doing. But yeah, I think the idea of a quiver killer, I think it exists for some people. You need to be someone who's focused on like a really narrow type of riding. And again, that's not like a bad thing. That's not like a knock on those people. I think what a lot of us do, you know, we were shopping for a car a few years ago and, you know, thinking about like, oh, what kind of car should we get? How, you know, do we need a big car? Do we need one with like a lot of, you know, range on it? And, you know, you start thinking like, oh, well, you know, we do a road trip like once every 3 years. So we're going to need a car that does that. Or like, we need third row seating because, you know, every now and then we take our kids' friends somewhere. But if you think about it, like rationally, you realize like, I'm not going to do that much. Like it doesn't make sense to compromise, you know, be driving around this like huge car 360 days of the year for those 5 days that, you know, you might do something else. And so hopefully that's helpful for people that are like, you know, kind of stuck in this indecision where you're like, well, you know, I might like to do this other stuff. If you like to do other stuff, then maybe like rent a bike for those days and have your bike kind of optimized for the stuff you do most of the time.
Yeah, totally. Or you know, you just suffer through the rides that are not, you know, well suited toward your type of bike, which is what a lot of people do, right? Like if most people are not like us and have a bunch of different mountain bikes lying around. Most people buy one mountain bike and they use it for everything. And before I worked in the industry, I was exactly that type of rider too. And if you're joining a group ride that, you know, you want to get out on, but is not totally like it's not a trail that's made for your bike, or it's not your bike's not made for that trail or that ride. It's like, you know, you're not going to turn down that opportunity to get out and have fun just because you're not on the right type of bike. At least I would hope not. You're going to be faster on the ups, or you're going to be slower on the downs than maybe your other friends are who have a different type of bike. But at the end of the day, who cares? It's like, get out and ride. And that's the bike you got. And
yeah, totally. Yeah. I think about like bike packing bikes, and Lee and I were just having this discussion the other day. Like, is there such a thing as a bike packing bike? And it's like the bike packing trips I've been on, you see all kinds of bikes. You know, some people are on like gravel bikes, some people are on drop bar mountain bikes, or some people have full suspension. A lot of people are on hardtails, but it's like, yeah, most people, it's just what bike do I have that's like closest to this, and you make it work. So yeah, don't feel bad if you don't have just the right bike for the ride or the trail.
Yeah, totally.
So finally, I want to ask or think about, like, where does downcountry as a category go from here? Do you think we're going to see it kind of evolve, or is the downcountry category as it exists today? Is this pretty much it? Like, what could you get a sense of that from looking at like the geometry numbers at all?
I don't know about the geometry numbers. I would say it's more so in line with the brands that are still a little bit behind the curve for whatever reason. Maybe it's their product cycle didn't line up with like the peak of the term. And I think most brands now, I mean, we had 21 different bikes in this analysis. And so each of them are from a different brand. And, yeah, I mean, there were still a couple that were coming out with their bikes like last year. So a couple years after the height of, I guess I would call it like the peak. If you look at Google, there's definitely a peak for the term downcountry. So I would say that the majority of brands have, their downcountry bikes have come to fruition, whatever it is going to be. And I think the term and the marketing buzz as a whole is going to die down a little bit because people just get fatigued or they care less about whatever is, whatever's been popular for a little while. I don't think the bikes are necessarily going to go anywhere. I think you'll still have like these really sweet short travel trail bikes, but I do think the like heat of the category is going to cool down a little bit, and consumers will, I don't know that they'll find another category they're in love with or whatever, but the bike industry definitely will.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I'm pretty bullish on the category. Yeah. Maybe not the term. Maybe we won't see it as much, but it does seem like it's a market that a lot of people are in. Obviously, like we said, trail biking seems to be the biggest one. Like if you're a new rider, that's kind of where you're going to enter, and a lot of people are going to stay in that area. Because again, it's a wide category. I mean, you could start out riding a 120 mil travel bike, and you could go all the way up to 140, 150, and you're still kind of in that trail category. So in terms of the category being big and like having room for this sort of subcategory, I feel like, it's going to exist for a long time. And then in terms of like the geometry, we've been saying this for a little bit. A lot of people have, that bike geometry, it has to settle down. I mean, not because like it can't keep changing, but it does seem like that has slowed down in terms of the changes. And downcountry being like a new category, you would think it would sort of evolve as people are figuring it out. But I don't know. This one, it seems like it's kind of, they've got it right now. And, I don't know. For me personally, there's not anything that I look at and say, oh, these bikes would be even better if they had like a slacker head angle or a steeper one, or, a little bit more wheelbase. Like, I don't know. There's nothing to me that's obvious about what you could do to kind of improve these bikes, make them more fun or more capable. So yeah, it kind of, for me, it seems like it's where it's at. It's not going to go anywhere. And hopefully that's a good thing for consumers, that, if you buy one of these bikes now, it should be good for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm still super stoked on the category, and I think the bikes are awesome. Like coming from, like I mentioned earlier, like this entry point into the sport where I was pulled in through longer travel bikes and being like, I ride enduro bikes and I drink protein shakes and I don't care about climbing and this and that. And it's like, like these bikes are actually fun. Like it's cool to go and put like a 20-mile ride on a downcountry bike and, slay the climbs and then be hitting all these bonus features and kickers and stuff on the side too, and feel like totally comfortable doing it. Like, yeah, I think they're awesome bikes.
Yeah. This is great talking about downcountry bikes, and hopefully kind of explaining the category a little bit more for folks who aren't familiar with it. If you're interested in learning about any of the bikes that we talked about, some of this geometry analysis as well, be sure to check Singletracks. We've got a landing page set up, singletracks.com/downcountry. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.